and some of you need the lessons right now. I believe that if our technology works as we think it should, that these lessons will actually be on a screen. And I'll turn around in a moment and see whether or not that's the case. But lesson number 1 is this: storms are often encountered in obedience to Christ. Storms are encountered when we're obeying the Lord, walking in his instructions. How's that? Is that, in a fallen world, it can't get much better than that. There it is. Storms are often encountered when we're doing the will of God. Let me ask you this question: were the disciples in God's will? Absolutely. Wouldn't you like it if Jesus came to you and said, "This is my will, get into this boat and go to the other side"? Could you be in the will of God more clearly than that? I don't think so. And yet, in the middle of God's will, in obedience to Jesus, they encounter one of the greatest storms they ever encountered on Galilee. Just because you're in a storm today doesn't mean that you're out of God's will. Because often the holy path is not the smoothest path. It's not always a path with little flowers on each side. Sometimes the holiest path is the most difficult path. The holiest path may be the roughest path. And here in the will of God, they encounter a storm that Jesus prepared just for them. Just because you're in a storm doesn't mean that you're out of God's will. To put it more clearly than I need to, God sometimes leads us into storms, as he did the disciples. So that's the first lesson that we have to learn. The second lesson is this: storms should remind us of the promises of God. Storms should remind us of the promises of God. You say, well, where's that in the text? I know that your pastor always keeps you in the text. So you have every right to ask, now where's that in the text? Here's the point I want to make. Storms should remind us of the promises of God because in verse 22, which I just read, Jesus said this: get into this boat and go ahead of me to the other side. Now, if the creator of the winds and the oceans and the rivers says, get into this boat and go to the other side, you will go to the other side and you will make it to the other side. Thank you very much. Once again, to be very clear, there was no chance that this boat would drown, that these disciples would drown, because God still had work for them to do. John was on that boat, and he had not yet written the Gospel of John and the letters of John, and Peter was on that boat, and God still had a place for Peter in his will and in his purpose. And all the way along, these disciples were held in God's hands, and if they'd have just remembered, hey, he said, go to the other side. We're going to make it to the other side. Let's enjoy this storm. To put it clearly, if you're to be hung, you'll never drown. Think about that and take that home with you for just a moment. Now, what should storms do? They should drive us to the promises of God. Think about things like this, the end of Romans chapter 8. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, distress, persecution, nakedness? That means poverty, or sword. That means death. There is nothing that will separate us from the love of God, for I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor any other created thing will separate you from the love of God. There are times when you have to hang on to a promise like that. And by the way, that's wonderful to hear you say amen. That's still legal in Florida, is it? You have to remember, I come from Illinois. Yes, and just while I'm thinking of it, I think, for example, of Romans 13, verse 5. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. In the Greek text, there are 5 negatives in that verse. I will not leave you, I will not forsake you. 5 times God says, never, 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 never. There are times when you have to hang on to those promises. Even like Martin Luther said, you look around and you see no reason to believe that God is on your side.